Hello everybody, Tall Paul here, and today I want to talk about Daggerheart. This past weekend, me and another GM were able to run a game of Daggerheart as well as play in a game of Daggerheart. I ran the Quick Start Adventure, while the other DM ran the Marauders of Windfall. Both of these were for Darrington Press's 1.4.2 playtest of the game. This was very exciting for both us and our players, as this is something we all wanted to try. So let's talk about it a little bit. So to start, what is Daggerheart? Daggerheart is a fantasy tabletop role-playing game from Darrington Press, the publishing branch of the Critical Role empire. This is a story-driven game built to create a world with the game master and the players working in kind of unison. This uses a 2d12 system. One of your d12s is hope, and the other one symbolizes fear. These dice will ultimately impact the outcome of your characters. The duality between the forces of hope and fear on every hero drives the unique character-focused narratives forward. In addition to the dice, there is the card system. It makes it really easy to get started and start seeing how your abilities kind of start stacking up. You have cards that describe the community you came from, what your ancestry was, and how those experiences kind of shape your character. Meanwhile, your subclass and domain cards grant your character plenty of tantalizing abilities to choose from as your character evolves. First, let's talk about the playtest packet. In the playtest packet, you actually get a quite good array of items. This is the GM's instructions. It basically tells you when this current edition came out, what the current edition is, the things that were updated, how to get your materials updated if you're using a previous version of the playtest. Next up, you have the manuscript. This is a 300 and some odd page document. This is basically their rule set for the game. It also has stat blocks for monsters, spells. It also goes through a lot of the different, core concepts of the game. And even when it talks about things like encounters, it mentions things like, is this the best way to move the story forward? Really driving home the fact that this is meant to be a story-driven game. After that, we have the Quick Start Adventure, which is the adventure that I ended up running during our gaming session. The Marauders of Windfall, which is the game that the other DM ran that I played in. You also get this really cool kind of GM guide cheat sheet. This has things like action rolls, example of GM moves, difficulty, how to set your different kind of DCs, hope and fear, how to spend hope and fear. This is also a sheet that I'll get into more once we get into the actual adventure that kind of guides you through your character sheet and tells you which different things do. And then a guide to kind of go through character creation if you're creating a character from scratch, including things like names. There's a play guide that you can share with your players, which is fantastic. Rest, equipment, and then some blank cards if you want to kind of homebrew your own stuff right off the bat. Now, before I started running the Quick Start Adventure, I did read through the playtest manuscript. I did not read it word for word. I looked for core concepts, rules, just kind of browsing it to get a good idea of what the game is and kind of how to run it. This was after I read the Quick Start Adventure. And from reading the Quick Start Adventure, I was fairly confident, even right off the bat, that I was going to be able to run this game effectively, even without reading the playtest manuscript word for word. Now, before we get into the nitty-gritty of the Quick Start Adventure, I will say that this is a fantastic introduction into the game. It is well thought out, well written, and really gives players and GMs a really good way to kind of just get in and start playing. Now, for me and my players, we had most of the materials that we needed to jump right in. So we hopped right into choosing characters. This is one of the characters that are pre-generated for this adventure, Marlowe Fairwind. You're going to give each player a 4-page character sheet. The first one is actually going to give basic rules as well as kind of a little bit of background on this character. The little standee right here you can cut out and just kind of fold into a little teepee, which is absolutely kind of a fantastic idea that I loved from this adventure. In addition, for one for every player character, there's also a couple of pages that have all of the different monsters as well as some scenery that your players will experience in the game. So you don't need any kind of miniatures or anything to really just hop right in and start playing. The connection section here was actually kind of a surprise. It's always good to kind of build a little backstory to a character, but these questions really drove home and created a start to the story for the characters with a little bit of background. Also, a couple of my more adventurous and, louder spoken players really kind of noticed that certain players weren't contributing and drew them into their connections, which would later down the road, I owe you a favor, would add to that story of, hey, I did this to return that favor, which was really fantastic. Next up, you have the actual character sheet for all of the different pre-gens. Very simple layout to the character sheet, but in trying to go through and understand what each section is and what it does, there's actually a really cool little tool, which is this sheet of paper. So basically the way this functions is you slide your put your character sheet on top of the sheet and just slide it over. The arrows then point to different sections, and these sections describe, like this one goes into evasion and armor, what's going on this part of the character sheet and how to use evasion and armor in combat. And the last section is just the cards. This is going to go over the community, the ancestry, subclass, and then a couple of the domain cards. These are fantastic. I didn't cut them out. I just kind of gave each player the individual sheets with them on it, but it was a very quick way to kind of see all of their characters' different abilities, and they, other than a couple examples, had really great explanations that allowed the players to understand how these different traits would work, both in combat and out of combat. And this is true for all 5 of the pre-gens that are available in this adventure. Now, the exact same 5 pre-gens are actually available for the other one-shot that the other GM ran that I played in. So if you have a consistent group, you can actually take a character at level 1 and then play it again at level 2 from the quick start adventure to their one-shot that is also available in the playtest materials. Now we get into the adventure guide, really at its core. Your players have their character sheets, and now it starts leading you step by step the things you should do in order to have a successful session of Daggerheart. And it does say that right here in the introduction. After the players get their packets, you go over the question that's on all the sheets as well as their connections between other players to kind of build that kind of group dynamic. It gives a quick little description of the setting, and then it also addresses fielding questions, and it reiterates that this guide is built to lead the players and you through a successful first session of Daggerheart and answer a lot of those questions, and it really does a good job of that. The next section guides the players as well as yourself through the mechanics. It talks about the character sheet and the way to slide it over. It talks about duality dice, and then it talks about how, roles affect the story, how combat comes along, how the action tracker works, and then it even gives you a character sheet as well as one of the instructional guides on it so that you can hold it up and show your players how to do it as well, which I thought was a really thoughtful little touch. Next, it goes into kind of things that you need to know as the GM, things that you should read in this section. It talks about the different ranges, talks about DCs and kind of how to set them, how to spend fear as a DM, and then it kind of goes into the synopsis of this adventure. It's going to be a total of 5 acts, and it kind of gives a brief little synopsis on each one. After that, it just kicks right into it. There are sections that you read. It tells you to read those aloud to your players. Shortly after that, you hit your first action roll. It guides it through you step by step, tells you the outcomes if they roll with hope or with fear, and then it goes right into the ambush, your first real combat encounter. Here, right in here in setting up the battle map, it actually involves your players in the setting up of the things that are around them. This really adds to the story-driven aspects of this game. There are certain spots at the beginning of the adventure where it asks you to ask players, like, what do the trees look like, and kind of help them build the way the world looks. with you? Who's driving the wagon? What do they see? But even in setting up combat encounters, it is involving the players in that action. Give them trees, tell them to place them around, and then, put the different creatures that they're being attacked by in that space. And it gives you kind of the ranges to put them in. It kind of really spells out their motivations. What are they doing there? The thief is trying to steal the wagon. And it really kind of guides you through that first encounter really, really well. After that, the players arrived in a little town. There were some NPCs that were available, kind of with some interesting story elements. The dwarf kind of asks, when their party's weapons were forged and if they had names. And it was really cool, interesting ways of especially for someone who is not familiar with running NPCs, to kind of have a little something that, they can just say or ask, and they don't have to come up with questions on their own. They then end up in a little tavern, which pulls the players back in to help kind of describe the different layers of this tavern. And the tavern itself is very cool. It's built in a tree. Each level's different, and it, has fun little aspects, like the players, the patrons of this tavern have to take off their shoes and hang them over a line, and when they leave, the shoes are cleaned and there's little trinkets in them. It's very kind of whimsical and cute. As the players progress through the rest of the encounter, it kind of opens up a little bit. It kind of does a lot of hand-holding towards the front, and then as you kind of move on to finding the individual you're looking for to deliver the package, it starts opening up, and it starts kind of allowing the GM and the players to kind of more wiggle room, if you will. It's not as, this is what you do, this is the result, this is what you do, this is the result. So there are a couple different ways that they can interact with the NPC that they're looking for. All of this leads towards the final kind of encounter in the adventure, the Open Veil. It is an ambitious encounter, I will say that. For a new DM, it might be difficult. You're putting 6 enemies on the board with 2 different skill sets. You're running a timer to tick down, as well as kind of using the resources you already have to kind of regenerate monsters as the adventure goes on. I was able to run it swimmingly, and it was actually, I thought, a incredibly well-written encounter. I think it was very dynamic and a lot of fun. I didn't feel like the players were undergeared or overgeared for it at all. I think it was a really nice conclusion to this kind of quick start adventure, and it felt very fitting for it. There's a little epilogue, kind of as you speak with the individual who you're kind of working with. It kind of leads up to kind of the next adventure and kind of places some things in place that if you want to expand on the world, you can. Overall, I really enjoyed running this adventure. I thought it was a really good introduction into Daggerheart, and I ran it as written, top to bottom. They said read it, I read it. They said do this, I did that. There were a couple spots, of course, with role-playing where I had to role-play and it went a little bit either one way or the other, but never so far that it was going off the rails. Now, here are the little cutouts for the NPCs, as well as the monsters, as well as a nice little action tracker you can cut out for your players to use. It's these small things that I found in this adventure really add up to a really positive experience for me. It's pretty easy to write a good adventure, but to really think about all of the small things that a new GM will need to run a game and provide those things in this playtest, I think it really kind of checked all those boxes. Now, the one thing that I mentioned before, and I am a little concerned about, is if someone has never GM'd a game before and this is what they're handed, there are a couple spots in it that get a little ambitious. The last encounter and then some of the RP spots really kind of lead into well-experienced DMs and GMs. For things like tracking monsters, they have trackers that are actually written onto the pieces of paper that monitor hit points, stress, and then have all of their information kind of tied in here. And their stat blocks are very fantastic, compact, and give you the things that you really need. Next up, it was time to go on the other side of the screen. So I was able to play Kari Nyx at level 2. This is the same kind of summary that they give you for the level 1 character. You get an additional experience. You get I've got your back, not afraid of anything, and let me reach that for you, which are kind of really fun experiences to be kind of handed to you. I used I've got your back a lot and not afraid of anything, and then a couple of let me reach that for yous, which for me, I'm an individual who's 6'8". It was a lot of fun kind of integrating those into my character. For the Marauders of Windfall, the whole adventure takes place on an airship, so it was a much more confined space than my adventure. We ended up getting into a couple of combat encounters, and that's really where I believe Kari kind of shined. Cool abilities like Whirlwind, I Am Your Shield, Body Basher really made the character feel dynamic, and it made me feel like I was heroic and, pushing the narrative forward in a heroic way, even through my combat. When it came to some of the other kind of role-playing aspects, I really didn't feel like there was a lot of additional things that I was able to kind of bring to the table with this character. With being a Ridgeborn and, living in the mountains, it really didn't apply to a skyship that much. But the GM, who I am a friend with, pulled my character in and used kind of my combat prowess to allow me to roleplay in a lot of situations and kind of contribute to the overall narrative of the story really well. The other players at the table with me are other GMs as well. So we really kind of tested the limits of the adventure and really drove it off of the rails quite a few times. It was a blast to play, and it was very easy to pick up, especially after having run the game once. For the adventure itself, I really won't give it a rating because it definitely, having driven it as far off the rails as we did, I really can't speak to how well it is written. I am going to run this adventure again for at least 2 more groups who want to experience Daggerheart. I'll be running the introductory adventure and then running Marauders of Windfall kind of in concurrent weeks. So one week we'll do the intro adventure, the next week we'll do Marauders, and then I'll go to another group. So I'm excited to be able to run this adventure so I can kind of speak to it a little bit better and how it is constructed. As far as playing Daggerheart, it was a very enjoyable experience for me. I felt like I picked it up really fast. I think for most players at the table, having a little bit of TTRPG experience is always going to be beneficial in situations like this, but I don't feel like I needed it. Through the adventure, though, I was able to use a lot of Kari's abilities, other than the class feature, which I didn't get the opportunity to use in the adventure. Every single card I utilized in multiple different points in the adventure, and that felt really good. There wasn't something just sitting on my character sheet that I never used or wasn't able to find kind of a use for, which felt, complete. It felt like everything here was useful, everything here was applicable. I just wish there were a couple more things that kind of helped me in more social aspects. So after this, how do I feel about Daggerheart? Well, I find Daggerheart enjoyable, engaging, and delivering on a lot of the points that they're trying to get across. This is definitely a story-driven game that is built on a fluidity between both the players and the game master. A lot of the struggles that I had as a game master were with me not understanding how free I am to make actions what I want them to be. I ended up piling up a lot of fear because I didn't use these things to do things like opportunity attacks or interrupt my players as much as I probably should have. When it came to playing Daggerheart, I had a little bit of hope, but at that point I knew I needed to use it because it is a free-flowing resource. It comes very quickly, especially when you're making a lot of ability rolls, a lot of attacks. Fear flies fast and hope flies fast. In the end, me not using that fear did not detract from my players' experience at all. I have a very good relationship with the players that I had at my table, and they were able to openly say how they felt about the different aspects and their abilities. The GM that ran Marauders of Windfall was actually one of the players at that table, so we switched so we could each get an opportunity to both run the game and play it. And he felt a lot of the same things that I did, that there was a lot of fear. We had a lot of this resource and we definitely should have utilized it more. He agreed that both of the adventures were incredibly well written and were great introductions into this game. This experience with Daggerheart is leading me to do what I mentioned before. I'm running 2 more groups through both the Quick Start Adventure as well as the Marauders of Windfall, and I'm going to be introducing some players that have not played TTRPGs before in these game sessions to see if that knowledge of TTRPGs as a whole, once that's gone, if players kind of pick up on it as quickly. I'm really excited to see what's in store for Daggerheart. I know they have 1.5 coming up sometime this month. I'm hoping it comes out before I do these 2 tests so I can playtest that as well and follow up with another video. I really appreciate you joining me today. We'll see you at the table.